Our elderly are being abused in many ways, by loved ones, relatives, neighbors, and strangers. Mary Jo Quinn, registered nurse, Court Investigation Unit, City Hall, San Francisco, conducted a one-day seminar for the Ball State University School of Nursing and talks with us about elder abuse and neglect. Mrs. Quinn, how extensive is abuse of the elderly?
Well, you know, we really don't know. As far as we can tell from the studies, which are very germinal studies, they're not definitive, but our best guess, our best informed guess is 4%, which means that approximately 1.1 million older people in this country are abused every year.
When you mention abuse, we think of physical abuse, being beaten and so forth, but you mentioned 5 types of abuse, so there are others.
Yes, there are. There's psychological abuse, where people are threatened, or where they're told that, you know, they're going to be put in a nursing home if they're not good, and most older people really fear nursing homes, even though, of course, there are some wonderful nursing homes available. The third type is financial. Unlike battered women and unlike abused children, older adults have money, and they have houses, and they have assets, and so financial abuse is a real issue with older people. The fourth type is violation of rights, and this is where mail is intercepted, or people aren't permitted to go outside the house to meet their friends, or they just can't have access to the telephone. And the fifth type, which is called self-abuse and neglect, is when you do these things to yourself. And it could happen because you have a lifelong pattern of not taking care of yourself, or perhaps with advancing age you've contracted some chronic illnesses that impair you, and so you just gradually stop eating and taking care of yourself, and you become self-neglectful.
Is this a problem of which people are as concerned as, say, child abuse?
I think they're becoming as concerned. The issue emerged in the late 70s with some of the early research reports, and I think that there's a lot of outrage when people hear about how bad some of the cases are. It's going to be interesting to see how the field develops, but I think we're getting a much better handle on the whole issue of domestic violence, the violence and the abuse that happens to vulnerable and less powerful family members.
We were reading and discussing new Indiana law.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think we have a hotline where people can call where they suspect abuse of elderly persons. How effective are these laws?
Again, we don't really know. We're just so much in the beginning stages of even acknowledging that elder abuse and neglect exist that we haven't had a chance to do really good research. We know that hotlines work very well for battered women. We know they worked well for parents who are under stress and in danger of abusing their children. So hotlines have a good history. So I'm optimistic that they'll be helpful. At least people can call and report abuse, maybe even confidentially, and they have some assurance that something will be done.
Americans are noted for non-intervention and not wanting to get involved.
Yes.
When should you get involved?
Oh, you mean a neighbor or a friend?
Yes,
or?
when you think there's something amiss, yet you're not certain.
Well, I think Americans also have a good history of being good neighbors. And so I think we have to kind of think that way. And good neighbors are concerned about neighbors on the either side of them, or in their block or in their area. And good neighbors worry when they don't see somebody. And if they hear screams or thuds coming from the house next door, they now have this hotline they can call. I think if you don't see an elder for a long time, or you see her and she scurries inside the house, or you know there's a lot of drinking or a lot of drugs going on, or things really don't look right in the family, or a son who had gone astray and perhaps served time in prison comes back to live at home and you don't see the old woman in the yard anymore. All those kinds of things are concerning. And it would just take a simple plate of cookies and going over and seeing if the woman's all right. And you can be a good neighbor and still not be intrusive. And I think we need to be concerned about our older people. They are, especially the ones who are impaired, very vulnerable. That's being a good neighbor.
Do most of these incidents of abuse to the elderly occur from within the family unit or from outsiders?
From what we can tell, it's a relative. Now we all know, and we've heard a lot about abuses in nursing homes and public facilities. And we know that there are all kinds of con men out there preying on little old ladies and cleaning out their bank accounts. And this is the latest form of abuse of the elderly to emerge. And the research studies are saying that 3/4 of the abusers live with the victim. And they are the daughters, the sons, the grandsons, spouses. Most often, however, it seems to be the son. And the son is somewhat dependent on the victim, dependent financially, dependent for housing on the victim, and even maybe emotionally.
That's very unusual to hear, because usually the relationship between mother and son is quite strong. Not always, of course, but it's interesting to note. And you mentioned the prison factor, too.
Well, I think we have to realize that abusive relationships are also strong. That doesn't make them necessarily good, doesn't make them necessarily supportive. But people may have very strong ties with each other in abusive relationships too. And there may be love coexisting along with the abuse. It's not a simple matter, and it's not an easy matter to deal with.
What are some of the cases you've had to deal with in San Francisco?
Well, I think I'll say that some of the cases I've dealt with in San Francisco are typical. You know, we in San Francisco have a history of being very, or a reputation, I should say, of being very different from everyone else in the country. So I want to be very careful to make sure that I tell you about cases that I know have happened also in other areas. We have dealt with cases where people had terrible, terrible bed sores, and that the people were being cared for by private duty nurses, RNs. And I myself am a nurse, and I found that case particularly abhorrent. The nurses simply did not give good nursing care, and they were being paid to the tune of $50,000 a year to do so. And it was extremely shocking. We had photos. We could not convince the sister, who was a conservator, to fire the nurses. And eventually we got the woman into the hospital and got her some good care. But we had real evidence that the nurses were not carrying out their job in that instance. I also know of an instance where there was actually sexual abuse. We had clear evidence, you know, bruises and even human bite marks. I know of at least another case where a woman lost an eye because of the abuse. Still another case where a woman is in constant pain in her eye because of the abuse from her son. So these things are not unique to San Francisco. They are all over the country.
You have police powers in your position.
I don't have particularly police powers, but people find it very hard to resist me because I am a court-appointed official. So people still have a great deal of respect for the court, and I do not have trouble, generally speaking, with gaining entry.
You have the power of the court behind you.
Yes, I do, and the prestige.
Are there similar positions to yours in other states like Indiana? Do we have this sort of?
No, for some reason California is unique in that they have court investigators assigned to the superior courts to do investigations whenever a conservatorship is involved. In Indiana you call it guardianships, and it has to do with somebody else taking care of the affairs of a frail older person. Usually the person is older. Sometimes it's a developmentally disabled person or someone who's been the victim of catastrophic illness or accident. For some reason our program has not been replicated. It may be difficult to replicate, I'm not sure, but we report directly to the judge about what we see and what we hear and what our recommendations are.
But you investigate every case where there's an elderly person involved?
We investigate every single conservatorship, and we rely on the clinical community, that is the doctors, nurses out in the institutions, the social workers that go into the field, the public health nurses, to tell us about cases and to work with us. The court really should not be that involved in people's lives. It should be agencies that can work in a more of a voluntary fashion. And the courts should assist when things get stuck or elders are really in jeopardy and can't take care of things themselves.
But it is effective.
It seems to be. It seems to be an effective model.
Also talking to the same group of nurses was David Wright, Deputy Director, Indiana Department of Aging and Community Services. He tells us about the new hotline to report abuse of the elderly in Indiana. Mr. Wright, our new law to protect the aged in Indiana from abuses of all kinds has been in effect only since what, September 1st?
September the 1st was when the law took effect, and it's not really just for the elderly, it's also for other endangered adults such as those who have mental handicap, who are mentally handicapped or developmentally disabled. Although we are finding that we're really covering more people who are elderly than any other age group.
Did your department, the Indiana Department on Aging and Community Services, push for this legislation?
Yes, we've pushed for this legislation. This was the 4th time, as a matter of fact. It's been introduced 3 times previously to the past year.
What kind of abuse do we find?
We're finding quite a wide range of abuse. It ranges anywhere from financial exploitation of an older person to sexual and physical abuse of an individual.
Physical abuse of the elderly is quite extensive?
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, it is quite extensive.
How are we going to prevent it with the new law? Who reports this?
Well, the new law requires that anybody who suspects that that someone who is an endangered adult is being abused or threatened of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, it requires that they report that suspicion to either a local county prosecutor, a local social service agency, law enforcement agency, or to a state hotline that we have where people may call and make a report 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Has this hotline been in effect since the law became effective?
Yes, we started, that hotline went into effect September 1st, and since September the 1st we have had through that hotline well over 100 calls.
What are the nature of the calls?
Well, again, they range from financial abuse of the elderly to incredibly bad situations of physical abuse. Older people being chained to their beds, locked in closets, things of that nature. They're pretty drastic kinds of problems that we're hearing about.
And you follow through on every complaint?
We follow through on every complaint. We report them to the proper local authority for investigation, and if they are substantiated as probable cases of abuse, then there's further kind of investigation made. If they are unsubstantiated, that information is also kept and perhaps kept on file. There might be further follow-up in a situation where we might get another call that might be very similar and might involve the same individuals. Something that might be unsubstantiated one time very well might be substantiated the next and hopefully remedied.
Does your organization have police powers?
We do not have police powers. I don't think you could say that. We certainly have a great deal of authority. We contract with 20 different county prosecutors around the state who work with other county prosecutors within their given region, and they also work with law enforcement agencies. The law enforcement agencies have been incredibly cooperative in this entire effort.
Are most of these complaints coming from people who observe these situations, are not connected with it, or do they come from those who are abused, or both?
They're coming from both. More often than not, it's not the abused individual that's calling. It is somebody calling in their behalf. But we do get a great deal of calls from the alleged victims themselves.
And how serious did you say the problem was in Indiana? The
problem is very serious. As I said, since September the 1st, we've had over 100 calls, a little over a month's time. We estimate that there are probably 5,000 cases a year that happen throughout Indiana, and probably 1 case in 5 will be reported.
Do you push for prosecution when you find these excesses?
What we're hoping for, prosecution when it's appropriate, is certainly desired, because if it's crime and there needs to be punishment, then certainly we would hope that would happen. But also, as a part of this program, it's a protective services program, so we hope that what might result is that the older individual or the individual that's involved as the victim would be provided with the appropriate services that might perhaps alleviate that problem. If it is a family matter, perhaps with the appropriate protective services provided, perhaps a family that might be torn apart or have some problems perhaps could be brought back together again. For instance, and let me give you just one example. If there's an older person who does need a great deal of care and a member of the family is the caregiver, there's a lot of stress on that individual who is giving the care. And if it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week that this care is being provided, perhaps what they need is a break from that care. An example, adult daycare, if they could have some place where just for a day they could take their mother or father, or perhaps for a weekend they could take their mother or father for what we call respite care, respite for the caregiver. In our minds, that's probably less expensive to an entire system and more effective than prosecution.
Why don't you give us the hotline number?
The hotline number is 1-800-992-6978. And again, it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Wendell Garrett, editor-publisher of the magazine Antiques, talked with the Friends of the Ball State University Art Gallery about historical preservation. He also tells us about the importance of antiques in historic preservation. Mr. Garrett, you're interested in historical preservation and antiques. We're going to talk on that subject to the Friends of the Gallery tonight. And when would you say the turnabout came and the interest peaked in, or if it has indeed peaked in historical restoration?
Well, it's clearly, Jim, a post-World War II phenomenon, and it was tied to, I think, several things. One, the high visibility given to preservation in Americana at the White House during the Kennedy years. It was also a period in which it was both intellectually but also financially exciting to become involved in the restoration of not only old houses but historic districts. And also I think that it was tied to that remarkable buildup that we felt just before the bicentennial, that there was a high public awareness of American heritage and the American past that we really hadn't experienced since the 1920s during that era of normalcy.
Are we continuing to see that interest in historical preservation?
Well, we are and we're not. One of the problems today is that with the government pulling back on the support of the National Trust, that the Trust, which has really been the vehicle and the most prominent organization to organize restoration and preservation around the country, is suffering badly. And for some reason, too, it may be that emotionally people peaked during the 1970s and have gone on to other things. There's still a lot of important groundwork being done, local work being done, but with the National Trust, I know, is probably half the membership that it was 10 years ago.
Because there are many states and cities that took projects upon their own.
That's true, and I think that a little like Johnny Appleseed, that these local efforts now are the most important. Clearly, in one respect, we can't expect it to come all from Washington, and I think that maybe now this grassroots movement is the most exciting going on, putting covenants on properties so that at least they can't be altered or changed drastically, historic districts rather than specific buildings where they preserve neighborhoods. All of these have come as a result of this great movement.
Your magazine Antiques is one of the leading publications in the field, and because you are a collector, you might tell us a bit about your collecting and interests.
Well, being a magazine editor, I am not able to collect that much, in particular with 3 small children in school, but my wife, who is also was a museum curator, and I have become very interested in the early 19th century, and particularly Boston furniture of what one might call the late Federal and Empire period. I think the early 19th century is one of the unappreciated areas that young collectors are getting involved in, and when one compares prices in that era, to the 18th century Augustan age of the arts, it seems to make more sense. But we're learning a lot more about the 19th century now, and I think that this is why a lot of young collectors are getting into that area.
We hear about the difficulty in finding 18th and early 19th century pieces, that they just aren't available.
Well, it is true, and yet I'm always reminded of the fact that as early as 1906, a writer in The Nation predicted that the antiques market in America would be finished within 10 years because supply was growing, demand was shrinking. But what has happened is that a lot of things have resulted. One is, when the price is right, these things do tend to turn up from families, from institutions that have the accession items, and still great masterpieces seem to come out of the woodwork from time to time. Then with the expansion of our conception of what is antique, this growth into the 19th century, the tariff law that now says 100 years makes anything old, antique, has resulted in a great deal of interest in the 19th century, so that what was once a restricted and tight little field has blossomed. And so there will always be an antiques market, I think.
We hear pros and cons concerning antiques as an investment, and of course it has been used as a hedge against inflation during the 70s when we had high inflation. The market was very strong, then it weakened in the early 80s, and do you agree it's starting to rebound?
Well, it is, but I must say, I have something of a prejudice against this interest in antiques as an investment. We all know that great collectors have always seen their objects appreciate in value to a remarkable degree. They're buying with love, they're buying with knowledge, but they're not buying to resell. And what happened during that period of a sluggish stock market and high interest rates and bounding inflation was that antiques, or what one might call more widely tangibles, became attractive. And what happened was that people came into the field who had no business being there, who had no interest or knowledge of or appreciation of these objects, and artificially inflated the prices. We've paid for that in recent years, but now I think the market is strong, it's solid. It will always be a good investment, but with inflationary trends and the way real estate goes, I'm not sure it's the best area to collect. I think one should just collect for the love and pure joy of it. That's what makes collecting so exciting.
That would be your advice regardless of the financial status of an individual?
Absolutely. In fact, I think that some of the most interesting collecting going on today is being done by people of rather modest means, but with immense knowledge, and knowledge is the best way to get buys. One should never look for bargains in this field, but buying with knowledge and restricting or defining or focusing one's interests, whether it's in ceramics or rugs or furniture or glass, textiles, this is the way to buy. And collecting today is not being done as it was in the 30s by the giants, the Henry DuPonts and the Morgans and the Fords and the Electra Webbs and the Imahogs, but now it's being done by anonymous young people. And this is what makes the field, I think, more broadly based, more egalitarian, and a lot safer.
How to protect yourself against fakes?
I bought them. Everybody has. They're liars. They never have. Say they never have. By knowledge. And that kind of knowledge comes in a variety of ways. I've had people say, well, you know, I'm going to be stung. That's why I don't want to get into the field. I have seen people get interested in an area and with intense reading, with visiting every antique shop they can get into, by visiting museums, attending lectures. Within a year, it's amazing how much one can learn about Oriental rugs or English 18th century pottery and porcelain. And with that kind of knowledge, and it's not only a knowledge of the eye and the mind, but it's that knowledge of touch. I've even had people say, I smell an object before I buy it. It's that sense of all the senses. Fingers, rubbing your fingers along the edge of something. You can tell whether it was made yesterday or made 100 years ago. Those telltale marks of fake come out some way. And it's that kind of detective work that protects a person against being stung too often.
And what advice do you have for a person that does have an expensive fake? What do they do with it?
Well, most people just swallow their pride and keep it. But there are today museum collections of fakes and forgeries that are very good for teaching purposes to students. And I've always urged people to give them to some of those kind of collections rather than putting it back out into the market trying to hook somebody else. It's much better to, because if it's that good, it should be studied for that reason. Yale, for example, in their art gallery has a marvelous study collection on American fakes and forgeries in furniture.
Classic example, of course, is the Brewster chair.
At Dearborn.
Yes, and the Ford Museum paid a great deal of money for it and has put it on display.
And institutions and individuals should be the same way. I think should be ready to admit these kind of mistakes. Generally, when one's made a bad one, it makes you a lot more careful the next time around. Most of us who have problems this way simply see a piece that we want to believe. It's so good, we've got to have it, and we just want to believe it in spite of ourselves. One should always approach an object with a sense that it really should prove itself. It's really wrong until it proves itself, particularly if it's underpriced or if it looks too good, if it's in too good a condition to be 200 years old. All of these things should make a person highly questionable and suspect, and that's why you want to take it and turn it over, examine it, leave it and go home and sleep on it, come back and relook at it. It's the hasty buying that gets people into trouble. And this is why one should buy with great discrimination. And this is the way the best collectors have gone about it.
Should be a combination of head and heart and not heart alone.
That's right.